In a survey of game wardens, 50% indicated they had experienced intimidation or retaliation from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Enforcement Chief's office in the last 5 years. This, combined with the perception of past leadership's desire to move wardens towards a law enforcement culture described as cops versus cowboys, has led to a divide within FWP's Enforcement Division. In the background and aggregating the divide is an increasing and changing use of recreation within the state. Without the consideration of data or the consistent use of this data from division leadership, wardens may face challenges prioritizing their duties in the face of a changing landscape. In one of our latest audit reports, we look at the culture within the Enforcement Division at FWP and consider how it could improve its use of Smart Cop to drive management decision-making. I'm content editor and host Eric Seidel, and I'm here with the author of the audit report titled FWP Enforcement Division, Managing Resources and Culture, Jeremy Verhasselt. Stay with us over the next few minutes as we discuss these issues and more on this episode of the Montana Legislative Audit Division podcast. So as I said, I'm here with the author of the FWP Enforcement Division report, Jeremy Verhasselt. Jer, how's it going today, bud?
Hey, Eric. I'm doing pretty dang good. I'm really excited to talk to you about FWP in Montana.
All right, Jer. If you wouldn't mind giving the listeners at home just a quick refresher, what did you look at with FWP, specifically the Enforcement Division?
We looked at the Enforcement Division within FWP. Obviously, we focused on game wardens across the state and their efforts. We looked at the structure, which is the chief's office in Helena. There's also the 7 regions spread out across the state, each with a regional office, and each of those regions has its own management structure, all the way down to the individual wardens who patrol their districts set up across the state.
And I know that wardens' duties were a big part of what you looked at here with this audit. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
So, Eric, like you said, we looked primarily at warden duties. These are primarily made up of enforcement of hunting, fishing, and wildlife laws, but wardens end up being jacks of all trades, taking on tasks such as enforcement and patrol of state parks, and also dealing with urban wildlife issues in some situations. And how they're tracking what they're doing out the field is through a system called Smart Cop. This system tracks hours in certain categories for what wardens are doing throughout their day, and really could be used to develop what's being prioritized and what they would like to see prioritized in the future from wardens all over the state.
Okay, so you mentioned Smart Cop kind of tracks these duties that wardens are doing. How does that data from Smart Cop impact or shape the objective of your audit?
When we looked at the use of Smart Cop, what we saw is kind of a disconnect between what we heard from the chief's office in initial interviews and what we were seeing in the data, and also a disconnect between the chief's office and wardens on the field, and kind of the priority associated with gathering data from Smart Cop versus doing kind of the day-to-day operations that you would more typically associate with a game warden. So those issues combined with changing recreation really exacerbated some of those issues that we saw originally in audit work, and also harmed the culture of the Enforcement Division. That led us to focus on 2 separate objectives. The first one related to that Smart Cop data and how management was using that data to determine the priorities for the Enforcement Division, and then also a look at how agency structure and the culture, along with the changing recreation, has affected the warden's abilities to do their job.
And what things does Smart Cop track?
As I mentioned earlier, Smart Cop is used to track the activities that our wardens are doing throughout the day. These activities are grouped into categories such as fishing access site patrol, criminal investigations, but they're also tracking things such as contacts. So every time a warden makes a contact with a landowner or a fisher or a hunter, so visiting with any of those groups, they track that. And it's also used to issue warnings and citations. So really what they have at the end of the day is a really good set of management information that they can use to track wardens' activities and priorities on a day-to-day basis.
And what was some of the other work you did for this audit?
One of the other things we did for this audit was a survey of all game wardens. We had several purposes to this survey, but one of them was just to determine how did wardens feel about Smart Cop. How were they able to use it on a day-to-day basis? What we found was there was some confusion about how to operate Smart Cop from a more technical side. There was also concerns about the accuracy and how accurately it was representing what they were doing on any given day. But maybe most concerning, there was just concern and confusion from wardens on the ground about what the purpose of Smart Cop was, what was the information being used for, and why were they taking the time out of their day and out of their patrol to be gathering that data in Smart Cop.
Okay, so as you look at the Smart Cop data, what does that data tell you?
When we looked at the actual data, what we saw was some categories saw an increase in hours that wardens were charging to them, and some saw a decrease. So we did notice a decrease in some kind of core function activities for wardens, such as criminal investigation, state parks patrol, and water recreation patrol. And we saw increases in areas such as administration, training, and then increases in some core areas like fishing access patrol. When we went to management to kind of determine what they got from this data, they often didn't have a specific reason why some of these increases and decreases were happening. They weren't aware of the info and didn't really have a cohesive plan for what they would do with information such as this or trends that have developed over time.
Okay, so based on that, I have to imagine that your first recommendation has to do with Smart Cop. What ended up being your recommendation there?
What we focused on in the first recommendation was really based around FWP enforcement creating a data management plan for the Smart Cop. This would tell them what information they were going to gather, how to consistently gather that information, how to analyze it once they have the data, and to determine what the data is showing them and how they want to use it to influence decision-making in the future.
And were there other issues that your audit found?
So one of the other main issues that came up very early on in the audit was the perception of wardens being cops or cowboys out in the field. How this was explained to us is cowboys is your more traditional warden function that you think about with the warden out in the field, working with landowners, working with hunters, really focusing on that fish and game type of activities. On the other side was wardens wanting to go into more of cop work. This includes traffic citations, drug and alcohol offenses, things like that. And there was really a perception that past leadership was interested in pushing game wardens more towards those cop functions and away from some of the traditional issues causing a lot of the cultural issues we saw during the audit.
I know MOUs play a role in that. Can you maybe explain to a listener what a MOU is and how it works?
So MOUs are understandings with county sheriff's offices where game wardens are deputized as sheriff deputies. And what we really saw this come through in Region 3 down in Bozeman, where these MOUs were more prominent. And this coincided with Region 3 having 75% of the citations for things such as drug, alcohol, and traffic stops. So it really shows how these MOUs can kind of push game wardens into some of those other duties not typically associated with what they're doing in the field.
And I could definitely see how this cops versus cowboys thing could turn into a cultural divide. But in the end, what should we expect out of wardens? What did you find? And did you have a recommendation with that?
I think you're right, Eric. It did lead to a cultural divide. So we really looked to statute to determine what should be the role of game wardens. And what we saw is statute is pretty clear that it should be focused on enforcement of those wildlife laws. It should be based on ensuring hunters and fishers are licensed, and also the enforcement of any department rules. And so that's where we went with our second recommendation, was for FWP to focus on those statutory duties in enforcement and also communicate that out to staff that was going to be the priority going forward.
Now, unfortunately, I know you also found some more cultural issues, some more issues regarding trust. Can you talk about those a little bit?
Eric, we really found a series of issues that have damaged the culture in the enforcement division. but maybe more importantly, really hurt trust between the wardens out in the field and the chief's office in Helena. When we sent out our survey, we found that 50% of the survey respondents, so game wardens, felt that they had been retaliated against in the past 5 years by the chief's office. A lot of the individual situations that we were told about in interviews related to a couple of situations where one was a past allegation of an inappropriate relationship in enforcement. There was also leaks of sensitive information, and those issues really harmed that trust level. We also found that the chief had been placed on administrative leave, as well as 2 other managers. We also found there was an internal investigation done by FWP of the Special Investigation Unit for a lot of the similar reasons of retaliation and issues like that. They ended up decentralizing that division as a result. So these examples just kind of highlight some of the issues that are interrelated and really have been affecting and damaging the culture and the trust between the Helena staff and those folks on the ground out in the regions.
Okay, well, I have to believe that all of that information leads you to a recommendation. So given that info, where did you land on your 3rd recommendation?
All of this information led us to a focus in the 3rd recommendation on training for enforcement and HR staff so that everybody knows that there are ways to make formal complaints free from retaliation, just so there's an understanding that that avenue is available to them. And then also to conduct an annual cultural survey of game wardens so they can identify the issue areas that, if they exist, like we did in the audit, and they can make a formal plan to correct those issues.
Yeah, and those sort of things obviously are tough to hear, but it does sound like this potentially was a problem more with past leadership and that things are improving maybe with current leadership. Were there some positive takeaways from the survey or in conversation when it came to current leadership?
There was some positive that came out of the survey of game wardens. 68% of the respondents believed that communication had improved with the change of leadership in the chief's office. So that shows kind of a focus to improve on that area going forward.
Okay, so it sounds like there is improvement. They're moving forward. That's good news. But I know there was one more thing you looked at in your audit. It had to do with hiring practices. How did all that come about with you looking at hiring practices?
In interviews with game wardens, we continually heard accusations of unfair hiring practices. And so we wanted to go in and review the documentation related to some of those hirings. When we requested that documentation, we found it was missing in all of the cases that we wanted to review. So we could not determine if those hiring practices were conducted according to agency policy and fairly. This led us to our 4th recommendation, which was to ensure HR has the documentation of all that's required by the hiring policy and also has documentation of independent oversight of those hiring processes. And then lastly, for FWP to follow the Secretary of State's retention schedules related to all those personnel files, just so in the future, third parties can go in and ensure those are happening fairly.
Jer, as we close out the report, it sounds like the takeaway is maybe it's the unfair hiring practices, maybe it's the cops versus cowboys, maybe it's even the allegation of an improper relationship. But no matter how you slice this, it really sounds like there had been a divide there within FWP's enforcement division. Is that fair?
I agree with that, Eric. We found that in both the hard copy review of the documentation, but more importantly, it just consistently came up when we were talking to wardens in the field. This is generally a population that's super motivated, is really dedicated to what they're doing for the sportsmen and women in Montana, and we found them to be kind of dejected with the turn and the trend of where the enforcement division had gone in recent years. So we're hoping that the recommendations in this report and a change in leadership at FWP and the enforcement division can get them back to doing what they love to do on a daily basis.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like there are quite a few issues here within this report, but that potentially, things are on the upswing there with the enforcement division. Now that we've gotten through your report, Jer, if you wouldn't just mind signing off, thanks for joining me. Thanks for sharing all the information here with your report of the Enforcement Division in FWP. And thanks for joining me on the podcast.
You bet, Eric. Happy to be here, and hopefully this podcast offers some insights to interested folks.
So there we are, FWP's audit on their Enforcement Division. It's always worth noting that if you want to read this audit report or any of our audit reports in full, you can go to leg.mt.gov and search under LAD. I'm content editor and host Eric Seidel, and until our next report episode, thanks for listening.